This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to the 50th episode of the Practice of Learning Teams podcast show. On today's show, Brent Robinson and I conclude our conversation with safety mythologist and historian Carsten Busch. Carsten is the Indiana Jones of safety and the author of the work of Heinrich, Safety Myths 101, and if you can't measure it, maybe you shouldn't. Recently, Carsten published his latest book, The First Rule of Safety Culture, a Counter C-Word Manifesto. His new book is about thinking critically about safety culture. The book also tries to offer some useful and practical suggestions for different approaches, or at least different ways of thinking about these subjects. Please sit back and enjoy the conclusion of this two-part series as we discuss the C-word in safety with Carsten.
Okay, well, doing safety walks is probably a more useful way to measure, if you must measure, than looking at what comes out in the end. But, well, I would prefer measuring as little as possible and rather get conversations going.
Yeah. And that's sort of where that's where we're at. That, you know, in Lean, it was always a gimbal walk or a really just talking to people out there. I don't care what we call it. I don't care what the words are, but we talk about everyday work. And I find those much more powerful. As long as you've got trust and rapport with the people that you're talking to. I see a lot of people go out there and say, I've done 2 safety walks this month. And, you know, you go and speak to the people that have just encountered that, and it looks a lot like a DuPont safety card to me. And I don't think that it's a very helpful way of doing it, because, you know, you're expecting that something's going wrong and you're trying to catch them out. So, you know, as long as they're positive and open, and I just see these metrics being developed off this, where people have an index and say, oh, you know, our safety index this month is 9.1. We're doing really well. I'm really nervous.
What does it mean?
I know.
I mentioned this in a endnote in a new book where, and I had written this down. I had totally forgotten about it, and I found it in my notes of 4 years' time, where we had an applicant who wrote to us. Well, she worked as a safety advisor, so and so, and she bragged about the results because she had moved the company from 0.38 to 0.65 without explaining what it meant. And I sat there and thought, what is this lady thinking? that she's impressing me with a number that doesn't mean anything? And by the way, a safety advisor moving a company. Of course, it's possible. Probably she fills out a report or whatever, but it's not the safety advisor who creates safety. It's the people, it's management, it's the interplay that creates safety, not the safety advisor.
Yeah, we've been working with one business, and they have this safety index, and you know, there'll be 9.1 or 8.5. And so you talk to some of the safety people and they say, oh, you know, it's really heading in the right direction. Then you talk to the managers and they go, oh, we just want to understand the mathematics behind it so we can improve our number. Yeah, I think you've missed the point at that point. I understand why you're trying to do it, because you want the best number out of all the divisions, but are you making your people safer is the question you need to be asking. And, you know, so they're so easy to adapt and manipulate sometimes, but I think we've got to be careful, because it sends the wrong message.
Yeah, I totally agree. At the same time, I think it's important that we as safety people also understand the power that it can have. because pushing for a number for a while can be very useful to get things going, but then we must be watchful that the number doesn't get the important thing. That's Goodhart's law. If a number becomes too important, then it loses its value. Mm-hmm. You can use it initially to get stuff going, and then, when it becomes the normal way of doing things, drop the number.
That's interesting. So you're saying that it can be the catalyst, but you can't then rely on it for all future stuff.
And I have a good example, I think, from my previous employer. This big, we were working on our culture. And at the time, I wasn't as annoyed about the abuse of the word, but we really did good stuff. We talked to people and all that. And as a part of that program, our CEO, or whatever her title was, she said, we will look at our improvement system, the deviations we have, and I do not want to have any overdue actions. So we will have this as a part of our weekly management team, and we will measure the divisions on it. And so they got going, because if the big boss wants something and the big boss wants 0, people work. And so we had some really tragic things that safety advisors would log onto the system on Sunday and move dates. Mm-hmm. All the stuff that's overdue, that they would move it forward a couple of weeks, because then on Monday Carsten is going to push the big button and there's the report, and then we don't want a number higher than 0 there. But it happens sometimes that I wasn't on the job on Monday, and I would do the report on Saturday, and then people would get all frustrated. Why did you do this? Because we need Sunday to fix the date. But then there was this one manager in Oslo, in the big area, and she had, like 40% of all deviations of the whole country, because in Oslo is where the train traffic was the railway administration. And she said, I am not going to do this anymore. We have a lot of work, we have safety and it's important, and of course we need to follow up our dates, but I would rather make my problem visible. I have a lot of stuff to do, and I don't have the time and the resources to get it done. And I'd rather make it visible than strive for a 0 that's just fake, because we waste time on moving dates. And this was accepted by top management. They said, okay, you're exempt from this 0 because this is a good argument.
Yeah.
And I think that's brilliant. I think it was great as a catalyst to show, and the CEO kept showing her commitment to, we do want to get as close to this number, but not at this idiotic cost of wasting Sundays on moving deadlines, and then thinking that we're safe.
Yes. Well, Brent and I talk about, the one thing I really like about lean is, people strive to have green, but the one of the great lean guys I've had the privilege of working with, Wes, said, Brent, when you've got all green, you've got a much bigger problem than if you got red. He goes, red's beautiful, because when you got a red card, you got a problem. So it's an opportunity to go fix it. And he goes, it's fantastic. So let's go find some red cards. And he, anybody that had all green, he would just, go, yeah, don't believe you. Let's go find some stuff. And that's the way he worked. And it's so true, isn't it? There'll be stuff that'll be hidden or covered up or moved or whatever it might be. It's so much more powerful and authentic if you can have that conversation.
So we use that saying, we call it embrace the red and fear the green.
Yeah.
Or as Todd will say, what's happening when nothing's happening? because there's that link between things that are in green must be good. Therefore, nothing's going wrong because it has to be in the green. And I think, Carsten, it's about maturity. The thing that puzzles me, I sort of wonder, have we got to that tipping point where we have to measure activities, because that measurement of activities has just become so commonplace throughout all different types of businesses, not just about safety, but we measure how people get paid by the hours they work. We measure absenteeism by the number of sick days. We measure all those things. We're doing lots of measurement of an activity, and I think the thing that frustrates me is that and risk management is also activity, but when you then look for the narrative that goes with it, it's just absent.
Yeah, it's many people are only interested in a number, and if it isn't counted, it's almost as if it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And if you try to come with a narrative, they may even say, well, you're now just trying to justify something.
Right.
Show us something objective.
Right, which is interesting, because when I think about risk management, when I look at a number, which is what they generate, or a color or a label, I'll always ask the question, where's the context behind that?
Yeah, numbers can be very useful, but then to have a discussion, or to hear what have you learned about it, or maybe even what are you going to do with this? What does it tell you, and what does it compel you to do? And we I describe it in the final chapter of this measurement book. We did have this routine in my current organization for a couple of years, until they changed the system, the reporting system, where we said to our underlying units, we do not want numbers. We can look up the numbers ourselves, because we have access to the system. So you don't need to tell us how many incidents you have had. You don't have to tell us what sick leave you have. What we want from you is what are you seeing? What have you learned? What are you going to do about it? Is there anything in here what others should learn about? Have you experienced something that other units that are comparable to you should be alerted to? And I think we did this for 2 years. And at first, they would just report, as they always reported, well, we've had so many falls and so many accidents with cars and blah, blah, blah. But gradually, they would turn towards the storytelling, what they had seen, what they had learned. And it was really great. But I think the controllers had a hard time.
Right. Yeah. With modern technology, and we're doing a couple of projects at the moment, with modern technology, being able to capture that narrative, being able to use artificial intelligence to help us get meaning from that narrative, that's where technology is really great now. That never existed. So we've been doing a project, and we wrote about it 2 years ago in our book, The Practice of Learning Teams. We talked about the fact that when we're engaging with workers, we're trying to gain insight through the narrative. That the stories they're sharing with us is all about the narrative, and from that we should be looking for insight. And what we talked about was that we need to capture the narrative from the worker in their own voice, not in our filtered voice. Because when we're out in the field, we're not doing everything verbatim. We're filtering the information and we're writing it in our own story, not their story. So we've been using some recent technology that's using artificial intelligence. And what it's doing is it's basically looking for those patterns of clusters, how that data starts to cluster, to try and make those weak signals more visible. But more importantly, is we're looking at the sentiment of the language that was used by the workers at the time. And that sentiment was telling us whether they're coping or not coping with that variability. And I think that's really been powerful, that you can take, you can strip out those keywords, those patterns, but link to its sentiment. So you could have, say, 10 different work groups, and the word resourcing might be coming up. Okay, so that's a weak signal, but that word resourcing doesn't tell me about their ability to cope. So 3 teams, the language they use said it was all being used in a negative sentiment. These teams, the language they were using was telling us it was in a neutral sentiment, and these teams were in a positive sentiment. To me, that gives me another depth and another dimension to that data. And so what we found was that humans are really struggle to see the forest from the trees. They really struggle to see the weak signals because there's so much noise. But once the AI technology identified the weak signals, then the humans could look at the narrative from that, and they're able to interpret that much better than computers could.
Interesting.
Yeah. And
yeah. Sorry.
Go for it.
Please.
Because what we've done is we've created some technology to actually capture those stories, but capture them in ways that workers can relate to. And then at the back end, we've basically built a dashboard that then shows that information in ways to trigger the organization wanting to engage and to be more curious and to understand more, rather than to highlight a problem or to highlight a cause. So what we're saying is that particularly with learning teams, one of the things I find really good about learning teams, it helps give you context to something. And through that context, through that storytelling, it helps to do problem clarification and then problem solving as part of that. But organizations will always have finite resources as to how many learning teams they can go out and run. Never going to overcome that. So the stuff that we've been looking at with Todd Conklin is about how can we get workers to lead and capturing that daily narrative that they're dealing with, and how can we take that and how can we start to see patterns? And if we can start to see patterns emerging, does that give us then the ability to actually go out and do some more targeted learning? And what we've found, Carsten, through this process so far is that workers have shifted their view of this process, because it's all worker-led, from being a system approach where they were having to evaluate and assess a system, meaning that the system is always looking for their permission, if that makes sense. So the system is having to give permission, to where through storytelling, workers are now being able to critically appraise information. And anecdotally, what we've seen so far is that the workers' perspective of their psychological safety has shifted because they feel that they've got more autonomy and more job control, because they're feeling that they're no longer having to give permission to the system is seeking their permission instead.
Super interesting, this.
Yeah, but it's all anecdotal. And at the moment, we're thinking about how can we use some form of evaluative assessment to actually, this sounds really bad, to measure that shift.
to make it science from anecdote to science.
Yeah, I know, which is quite sad, isn't it?
But one of the things we're gonna hear, which is back to your latest book, Carsten, will be, but before you can do that, you need to change the culture of the organization from the top down. I'm willing to put money on that at some stage. So, I've seen enough lean implementation to say you have to start at the top and work your way down, and it's all about the culture. So I'm keen to hear your views on that, because I think that's we have heard that quite a bit, haven't we, Brent?
And there are so many books saying it, and also the big names tossing around must come from leadership and so on. But well, my HR director, she would say for many years, and so far she's kept her word, we are not going to do a culture project. We will change or influence culture through changing the way we work. And I think that's great, because then you, if you need to change it all, and well, probably we want to change some aspects of culture or how we work, just change it through every day by introducing new means of working, by introducing new technology, other forms of, I think the way you described it, Brent, to gather data and patterns and make the voice of workers at the sharp end heard, and try to find the real issues behind what they report. I think that's a brilliant way to affect culture and get other stuff going.
Yeah, because there's always going to be outliers. That's because we've got to ask the question, well, what happens if we miss something? Well, I can tell you, you're missing it all now. If you're not listening to workers now, you're missing all of it. You're missing every weak signal. You're only seeing, and Todd's analogy is that iceberg analogy, that organizations are only seeing it from the sea level and above. And they're only seeing the strong signals, because that's only when weak signals become strong. It's once it's actually gone above the water level. And I recently, I've just done this diagram that basically has Heinrich's pyramid above the sea level. And then we put Eric Honagel's circles of learning alongside it. And then, yes, we tilt Heinrich's pyramid slightly and then extend it out, get rid of the numbers and just have the categories. And it's quite fascinating how they look very, very similar at the end of it.
It's been a little controversial in some areas, though, hasn't it, Brent?
Yeah, that Heinrich was so misaligned or misunderstood, or I would actually like to say, after reading your book about Heinrich, Carsten, I'd actually like to say that he was using language of an era.
Yes, he was. You have to put his work into the context, as we should do with everything. The context of the time he was working, and well, there were some big things going on in his time. You first had the major financial crisis, which was probably fortunate for him, because his message was heard. He had a way to save money through safety. Brilliant. And he even had numbers to prove it, which was double brilliant. And when the big crisis was gone, then there was the war. And again, safety was essential, because every lost work hour in a factory was going to harm the war efforts. And then that was even so strong that there was propaganda in the United States at the time saying that, aligning accidents with sabotage, unwanted sabotage, which is quite strong language.
Wow.
We are now speaking about blaming workers. Well, you're blaming people at the time of being traitors.
Yeah, committing treason.
Yeah, it's treason. You have an accident, you're a traitor.
Which has towards the death penalty.
Yeah, well, that would be a really lost time. But that's the context of Heinrich's work, and then of course the whole relationship, that they were different. He has this phrasing that we wouldn't use this time, and it was a male society, of course. The early safety writers, they write about safety man and workman and foreman, and it's the context. So you have to understand it. But if you look at what is he really saying and strip away the numbers, then it's ahead of his time, and it's timeless in a way, what he's saying. And then there is this other thing, keep in mind who his audience is. Because we read his books as if they're safety books. And they are, of course, because they are about safety. But they are first and foremost management books. They're books directed at managers, top managers. And he tries to hand them practical ways to deal with a problem that they knew nothing about. Well, they thought they knew nothing about, because he says to them, you can run your business, then you can also run your business safely, because the principles behind it are basically the same. Find the problems, look behind the problem, find a suitable solution, and put it in work and follow up. So he has this plan, do, study in his work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, and when we think about Edward Deming, we think about him that, at the end of World War II, he's tasked with supporting the Marshall Plan in Japan. And of course, the Japanese are having to do things with whatever they've got. They don't have the luxury of being able to source all these raw materials. They have to make do with what they've got. So of course, his whole thing, that whole sort of genre into the whole lean and Toyota is ideal, because now they're having to, optimize everything, and they're having to innovate.
But isn't it interesting that Heinrich was actually on the same path? They're both on the same, one built from, I don't know if one built from the other, but they're very much aligned, really, in terms of...
Yeah, I think they are, and Eric, he writes a bit about it in his, is it in his Synesis book, where he does discuss Schubert and Deming and a bit of Heinrich. And I've actually been in contact with Eric at around the time he asked me, do you know whether they met at some point? Schubert and Heinrich, trying to find out, but I don't think they ever met. But I think if they had, they probably would be, well, very much in sync. Even though they were totally different people, because Heinrich, he was this blue-collar guy who didn't have an academic education. Well, Schubert, he was this brilliant academic.
Mm-hmm.
And Deming was a statistician. So it's I just love how the two have come together. But I hear this conversation here in Australia where people are saying, this doesn't work, and quality circles, and that quality movement has died out. And I'm thinking to myself, you really need to go and have a look, because it hasn't. It's just changed, and it's adapted over the period. And it's as relevant today as it was 10 years ago or 30 years ago. And we're all still using some of those tools and some of those processes and ways of thinking about stuff. I always find that amazing, that there's a new shiny thing over here. I'm not so sure. Looks like something old.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's yeah. And some of it is simply just a pig with some better lipstick painted on it.
Yes.
Yeah, or just the time may be ripe now, because now we have concepts and words to describe stuff. Because if you look at all the new view stuff, it really isn't that new. But now we finally have the words, and we have put it together with some other scientific areas, I think. Like complexity science, which now has become much more mature, and then we've left the purely technological, psychological part of safety that we've been in from, the beginning of last century until the 70s, and then sociologists have found a much greater voice, because I think most of the interesting stuff in safety written in the last decades, it comes from sociologists like Charles Perrow and Diane Vaughan and Barry Turner. I'm a big fan of Turner. That's sociology, not the traditional technological or psychological safety, which, because of the science they are, is much more reductionist, while the complexity science, system science, sociology, they look at the whole and the interactions in the whole, and that's what makes it interesting for me. And
I think I agree. It's that holistic approach.
Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We would love to hear your learnings or other topics you would like us to explore about learning teams. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and give us your feedback. Become part of the community of practice with learning teams. Go to www.learningteamscommunity.com. Support the authors of the practice of learning teams. Purchase the book from Amazon.com or go to www.learningteamsbook.com for an inside look and other free book resources from the authors.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.